Hello, and welcome to another episode of Her Head in Films. I'm Caitlin, and I'm your host. On this podcast, I share my thoughts and feelings about films. What makes this podcast unique is that I weave in my own personal experiences with the films that I talk about. I discuss the impact that cinema has on me and why I connect so deeply to it. As I like to say, my head isn't in the clouds, my head is in films. This week's episode is all about Abbas Kiarostami's 1990 film Close Up. I adore this film. I feel a very deep connection to it. It's part of a series that I'm doing about formative art house films that really made me fall in love with cinema. In the series, I've talked about The Passion of Joan of Arc, La Jetée, Cleo from 5 to 7, La Ventura, and now I'm talking about Close Up, because this is a really important film in my life. And Abbas Kiarostami is a director who I really do love, and I think his work is so important. So I hope you'll stick around and listen to this episode and listen to me talk about Close Up. Her Head in Films has a Patreon where you can financially support the podcast on a monthly basis and also access rewards and extras. This week, a bonus mini episode that I did for my for patrons at a certain level was an episode about Alice Guy Blaché, who's considered the first woman filmmaker, and she's a really important figure in the history of cinema. So if you'd like to listen to that episode, you can become a patron. You can find more information at patreon.com/herheadinfilms. At one level, you get a shout out on each episode, so I would like to give a shout out to my patrons Spunden, Polina, Olivia, Carolyn, Jesse, Feminist Overlord, Michelle, and Lindsay. Thank you all for your support. You really do make the podcast possible. If financial support isn't an option, consider reviewing the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, telling your friends and followers about Her Head in Films, or just sending an encouraging message to me. I'm on Facebook at Her Head in Films. I want to talk a bit about Abbas Kiarostami's cinema, a bit about his life and his work before I get into my full analysis of the film. For those of you who have not seen Close Up, I do want to give you a brief summary which will help you as I'm talking about it. It's about a man named Hossein Sabzian, and he is in love with cinema, and he adores cinema. And this is a true story. This actually happened. Sabzian pretended to be a very famous Iranian filmmaker named Mohsen Makhmalbaf, who's very iconic and legendary director in Iran. He lied to this family and said that he was Makhmalbaf. He even went so far as to say he wanted to make a film about them and use their home as a shooting location. He is found out. His charade is found out. He is charged with fraud, and there is a trial. And Abbas Kiarostami read about Sabzian's story in a magazine. There was this journalist who wrote a story about it, and so he decided to make a film. The film came out in 1990, and so it's really about Sabzian, his duplicity, that he lied about being Makhmalbaf. But more than that, it's an innovative film because all the people involved in this very true story play themselves in the film. They do reenactments of certain scenes. There are scenes of the trial that Sabzian went through. So it's a film that blends documentary and realism, fiction and documentary. And it uses the actual people in the film. So when you're watching the film, you never really know what you're watching. It's really an uncategorizable film in a lot of ways because the people are playing themselves, but they're reenacting scenes. So at times it feels like a documentary, but then at times it feels scripted, and it is scripted. So it raises larger questions about identity, about the art of cinema, the artifice of cinema and documentary, the way truth and reality are constructed. But for me, more than anything, this film is about the power of cinema, the power of film. It is a movie about a cinephile, about a man almost feverishly in love with film and how he is consumed by cinema as well. And that's sort of the most compelling part of it for me, is this character of Sabzian. But I did want to talk a bit about Kiarostami. His cinema means a lot to me. His films mean a lot to me. This film is part of a series, as I said before, that I have done about formative art house films that have made me fall in love with cinema. I talked about The Passion of Joan of Arc, La Jetée, Cleo from 5 to 7, La Ventura. These were films that I saw in 2011 when I became interested in European art house film. Now, Close Up is really central and important in my life because I watched it a few years later. I watched it for the first time in 2014. And for me, Kiarostami's cinema takes me beyond Europe. It gets me interested in Iranian cinema, of course. I do watch Iranian films when I can. I haven't watched as much as I would like. I haven't even seen a Makhmalbaf film. But I've seen some of Farhadi's work, who I really love, especially A Separation. That's really an essential masterpiece, I think. So Kiarostami opens me up to Iran and Iranian cinema. But he just gets me beyond Europe, really. And I start to fall in love with other directors like Yasujiro Ozu or Satyajit Ray, going beyond Europe, going beyond the West, and looking at cinema that is in other parts of the world. And personally, his work is just very moving to me. There's a humanistic quality to his work. I sometimes turn to it when I'm depressed. This actually happened when I did an episode on the podcast about his film Taste of Cherry. I was going through a difficult depression, and I talked about that in the episode because it's a film about suicide. We don't know if the main character is depressed, but it's possible. I've talked about Kiarostami numerous times on this podcast. I talked about Taste of Cherry. I talked about his Coker trilogy, which similarly blends fiction and documentary in a lot of ways and has so many layers to it. It's really fascinating. I talked separately about a film from that trilogy called Where Is My Friend's House, which is this really beautiful film about a little boy. So I've talked about Kiarostami several times. I just love his work. And I find it very moving. So I did want to talk for a little bit about him and about his work. He was born in 1940. He died in 2016 on July 4th. And this was a devastating loss to world cinema, because Kiarostami really is considered a giant. I mean, I get nervous even talking about his films. I don't feel worthy of it. I don't feel smart enough for his films. There's Bergman, there's Tarkovsky, there's all these big names, and there's Kiarostami. He's certainly up there with the greats. And he's in my top 5 at least. I mean, possibly top 3. Krzysztof Kieślowski is number 1 for me. And I also really love Yasujiro Ozu. I love Abbas Kiarostami. I love Agnes Varda, of course. So I have several that I really love. I love Ingmar Bergman. So I would definitely put Kiarostami at least in my top 5. So I read this article on Senses of Cinema to do some research about Kiarostami because I want to give you some background about him and about the Iranian New Wave that he was part of. It's written by Murnaz Saeed Vafa. This article, it was written in the early 2000s, 2002. So it's not the most current thing, but I thought it gave a decent overview, of him. And in that article, he writes that Kiarostami actually started with painting. He was sort of a painter, and he was interested in graphic design too before he became a director. And the painting reminded me of my episode on Michelangelo Antonioni and his film L'Avventura. Antonioni started as a painter. And I was also reminded that Agnes Varda started as a photographer. So it's very interesting sometimes how these really great directors do not immediately start out in film. They sometimes come from the visual arts. And that's apparently how it was for Kiarostami. He is considered part of the Iranian New Wave, specifically the second wave that began in the 1960s. Some characteristics of these films, according to Wikipedia, which I looked at, they're realistic. They use a documentary style. They're poetic, allegorical, self-aware. They can tend to focus on the rural and the working class. For Kiarostami, I'd add the use of non-professional actors, which he did throughout his career. In a lot of his films, he used non-professional actors, and obviously Hossein Sabzian was not a professional actor, and none of the people in Close Up are professional actors as far as I know. I mean, there might be a few in there. Kiarostami really had a propensity for blurring fiction and reality. That happens in so many of his films. And his films also have a humanistic quality to them. And I wanted to read this quote by Saeed Vafa because I really agree with it. And he says, quote, "What distinguishes Kiarostami's style is his unique but unpretentious poetic and philosophical vision. Not only does he break away from conventional narrative and documentary filmmaking, he also challenges the audience's role. He plays with their expectations and provokes their creative imagination. His films invite the viewer to reflect, confront stereotypes, and actively question their assumptions," unquote. And provokes their creative imagination. I definitely agree with that. I think there's a lot of gaps in Kiarostami's cinema, and that he purposely creates those gaps for you to fill in for yourself. I think watching a Kiarostami film does require a certain level of imaginative thinking, and you have to make those imaginative leaps for yourself. I think a good example of that is Certified Copy, that starred Juliette Binoche and came out a few years ago. I still have not rewatched it. I saw it when it came out, and it completely baffled and perplexed me in every possible way. I don't think I got it then. I probably wouldn't get it now either. I'm not going to say I like the film because it was so hard. I didn't understand what was happening, but I think that's a really good example of the way he challenges the viewer to use their imagination, to fill in those gaps, to figure out for themselves what is going on, because he is not going to supply you with all of the answers. So I think Certified Copy is a really good example of that. I think I should revisit it. I don't know when I will, but that was one of those films I didn't get. But maybe I'd get it now. I don't know. In 2012, there was a Sight and Sound critics poll. They periodically do these polls, Sight and Sound magazine, to gauge what the greatest films are. And they ask, there's one for directors, there's a director's poll, and then there's a critics poll. And in the critics poll, Close Up was put into the top 50 greatest films of all time. It was put at number 43. So I think that indicates to you how important this film is, and how people who love film love this film. I think if you're a cinephile, I think it's absolutely essential that you see it, because it is about loving film. It's about being obsessed with cinema. It's about where cinema takes us, how cinema can help us live, help us survive. It can comfort us. It can represent our suffering and reflect our suffering, because that's why Hossein Sabzian loves Makhmalbaf so much, is that Makhmalbaf in his films represents the suffering of the working class, of the struggling person. And so On the Criterion Collection website, Godfrey Cheshire has an essay called Close Up, Prison and Escape. And he gives us some information about why this film is so important and why it was so innovative. Cheshire writes, quote, okay, let me find it. Quote, the film's key innovations, the unorthodox mix of documentary and fiction, the self-reflexive musing on cinema and its impact, the simultaneous exaltation and questioning of the auteur, may have had certain precedents in both world cinema and Iranian culture, but Close Up fused them in a wholly new and original way, unquote. So Kiarostami, he's not the first person necessarily to mix documentary and fiction, but he put all these different elements together in a really unique and innovative and creative way. And he created a body of work, I think, that is unique, that is his own, and that has a signature style about it, you know? And so other people may have been doing bits and pieces of what Kiarostami ultimately did, but they didn't fuse it and synthesize it together the way that he did. And a really important aspect of understanding this film and appreciating the film and analyzing it too is understanding how constructed it is, that it feels like a documentary and it feels like you're watching something unfold in real time, but you're actually not. Cheshire writes, contrary to what most first-time viewers assume, none of its scenes are strictly documentary. Not just the reenactments, but all the other scenes too, are at least partly scripted or otherwise contrived by Kiarostami. In effect, the film is not one in which documentary is blended with fiction, but one in which an intricate fiction is composed of real-life materials, unquote. So the key to understanding this film, I think, is understanding how constructed it is and scripted it is to a certain extent. That we are not seeing things happen in a spontaneous, unscripted way. We are seeing it be reenacted. And that comes and that can best be exemplified by the final scene. And I will talk more about the final scene in my full analysis of the film. But again, I want to share this quote because I think it's the key to understanding the film and really an interesting way to think about the film and why it's so unique, but also why it's so difficult to talk about. I really hope that if you're listening to this episode that you have seen Close Up, because it's a very difficult film to talk about. What I'm going to try to do in my analysis is go chronologically through the film. Sometimes I'll talk about a film through its themes or through certain scenes. But I think with this film, I have to go start to finish, and I have to talk about different things that happen, and I want to share my notes and things I was thinking about as I was watching it. That's important to me too. I feel a very personal connection to this film, and yet at the same time I struggle with it because it raises such complicated questions, because it is a complicated film that is operating on many different levels at once, on the level of documentary, on the level of fiction, and it's raising questions about those things. It's destabilizing our expectations of a film. At the beginning it says based on a true story, and it tells us that the actors are playing themselves. So from the beginning, we know that something very different is happening, that these people are acting, but they're also being themselves or acting as themselves. And so I think it makes us think about the artificial nature of films, but also the way that truth is constructed, the way that reality is constructed. These are very difficult concepts for me. I'm not an intellectual person when it comes to film. I'm more of a feeling person. So I'm not really sure how to engage with these ideas because I don't know if I have anything original to contribute about them. But I'm going to do my best with this film. It feels so much bigger than me. It feels so beyond my capabilities. I get nervous even talking about Kiarostami or talking about his cinema but the film means so much to me that I'm willing to make the effort, even if I fail, even if I'm not as good as I'd like to be at it. I'm not good at like postmodern stuff. And Kiarostami is definitely seen in many ways as a postmodern director, a postmodern auteur. And because his work is so challenging in that way. But an important aspect of this film is the way that it's constructing the narrative, constructing the story, and asking questions about the way truth and reality are constructed, especially through film. And so, in the final scene of the film, I'm just going to be brief about it. Sabzian is released from prison. The charges are dropped against him. And Makhmalbaf shows up, the man that Sabzian has pretended to be. And the two men get on a motorbike and they just ride through the streets. Sabzian is very emotional. He's overcome. At one point, the sound goes in and out. We're led to believe that there are sound issues. And the whole thing feels so real. It feels so spontaneous. It feels so unscripted. You think that you're watching a real, truthful, emotional moment. But Cheshire writes something very different. He writes, quote, "Each viewer will have to decide whether this ending is compromised by its wholesale contrivance. In reality, Kiarostami coaxed the judge into his verdict. Even Sabzian went to the judge later and complained, saying he felt sure Kiarostami had somehow tricked him. As for the moving departure from prison, it was staged, and Kiarostami shot from a distance purely for dramatic or docudramatic effect. And those sound problems? Most were created during post-production to serve the final scene's emotional punch," unquote. And so, as I said before, the key to understanding the film is understanding how constructed it is, how in some ways artificial or fake it is, I guess you could say, but how it doesn't feel that way, how it manages to feel real and authentic. And it raises questions, when we see documentary attached to a film, or when we know a film is fiction, what are the preconceived notions we bring to it? What are the expectations we bring to it? Even a documentary is a constructed thing. We think we're seeing something unscripted and spontaneous, but are we really? Sometimes we are, but there's still a director. There's still someone editing parts together. There's still an angle. There's still a bias. And so if anything, I think Close Up makes us think deeper about film, both documentaries and fiction films. And that is why my analysis is going to be so deep and thorough, because I think this film warrants it and it needs it. I want to go as deep as I can into this film because I think it's asking deep questions. But at the same time, I think it's also a really beautiful humanistic portrait of a dreamer, of a man who is a dreamer, a man who is sensitive, a man who is a misfit and does not fit into the society where he lives, a man who longs for, I think, some kind of transcendence through film and an escape through film. And there's something very beautiful about that, about this man who is poor. Sabzian is poor. He has children, but his wife has left him because he's poor and he can't provide for her. He can barely, survive most of the time. But cinema enters his dreams. Cinema comforts him. Cinema, and through this film, through Close Up, he is centered. He is able, I think, to live out his dream to a certain extent, even if it's only for this film. And he's able to enact his cinematic fantasies, I think. So much is happening in this film. But at the same time, it's very constructed. And there is a manipulation that is taking place, that we are manipulated by this film, by Kiarostami, But in a way, isn't there a level of manipulation in every film? Yes, Sabzian lied. He lied about being a filmmaker. He lied to this family. But so many directors lie. They lie through their films. It's all a lie. All films are a lie. They're not real. They are not real. You know what I mean? And yet they are things that feel real, that these stories feel real, the characters feel real. So the directors in many ways are lying, but the lying is the path to the truth. The lying creates revelations that take us into the truth. And so we are being manipulated, but I think we're entering into that manipulation, and we're choosing that manipulation because of what cinema gives us, because of the power that cinema has. And it has a profound power over Sabzian. And his story, I think, is the story of so many cinephiles, of so many people who love film with all of their hearts, the way I love film. Why am I doing this podcast every week? I'm doing it because I love film. I put a lot of work into this, a lot of time and effort and work. But I love film and I love cinema. And above all, I think this film, even as it challenges us, even as it destabilizes us, even as it raises important questions about film, I still think it is a love letter to cinema. I still think it is a portrait of the power and transformation and transcendence of cinema, and what cinema means to one man, and the way it changes him and helps him survive and helps him live. And so there's so much richness to this film, and that is why I have to talk about it. So now I want to talk about the film. I want to give my analysis. I'm so hesitant about it because I'm so torn. How do I talk about this film? How do I not talk about this film? It's just everything, and watching it again 4 years later. First time I saw it was in 2014, and now I'm rewatching it in 2018. It still knocked me out. I mean, it was made in 1990. I was born in 1989. So this film comes out the year after I'm born. And it certainly doesn't feel like it's from 1990. It doesn't feel dated. It feels timeless. It feels close. It's a film that I think you hold close to yourself, really, and that you never forget or let go of. And my personal connection to Kiarostami's work continues. I feel very deeply about it. And I was very open in my episode about Taste of Cherry, how at the time I recorded the episode, I was going through a depressive episode, and I was really struggling. And it's interesting how something similar is happening now with Close Up, that this week that I made this episode and watched it, I've really been struggling with depression. And I would say that sometimes Kiarostami's films really do help. I mean, they're certainly not a cure for clinical depression, but they give you a sense of warmth and humanity, and also just give you things to think about, to put your mind on something else. And that's what Close Up kind of helped me with this week. I have just been obsessing about this film all week and trying to think about how to do this episode. So I just want to go from the beginning of the film to the end of the film, talk about certain scenes, talk about things that I was thinking about as I watched it, and I just want to raise questions. I want to raise issues. I want to share my thoughts. For me, the central thing about this film is that it is about obsession. It is about a man overwhelmed by his obsession with cinema, because the act that sparks all of this is Sabzian pretending to be Makhmalbaf. He wants to become this other person, and it's partly because of his obsession with cinema, obviously, and his desire to be somebody else. What does it really mean for cinema to take over your life to the point where you would pretend to be a film director, to the point where you would lie to people, where you would, in some way compromise your morality, I guess, and pretend to be this person that you are not? And I think that's an important question in this film, and I think it's a question that Kiarostami is trying to answer, of why did you do this, Sabzian? Why did you pretend to be Makhmalbaf? But I think it's a testimony to the life that a film takes on in the viewer, the life that films and cinema take on in the people that watch them, how those films continue, how they can sometimes turn into an obsession. And so I would ask you to sort of keep that in mind, as you watch the film or as you think about the film, is what is it showing us about obsession? I think that's an important aspect of it. And I mentioned this earlier, but I want to reiterate it too, that in this film, I don't think we're ever comfortable with it, because we're never sure what we're watching. If we're watching a documentary or a narrative film, we're always uneasy, I think, and destabilized by the film of what's happening, what's real, what's not. That was always in the back of my head as I was watching this. And I did watch it on Filmstruck, and it was really lovely to watch it. Filmstruck has extras usually included with a lot of the films that they show. And this one had several extras. There is interviews with Kiarostami. There is audio commentary by Jonathan Rosenbaum. He's one of the people in the audio commentary, and there's all kinds of stuff. There's an extra film by Kiarostami, so I did not have time to watch everything. I did what I could. Because of my depression and what I've just been struggling with, it took me a while to get all this together, and time has been running out, because I try to release these every Sunday, and I try to stay on a schedule every week, because regularity is important with podcasting, so I do try to do that when I can. And it's a pleasure to talk about these films, but it takes work to do the research, to get my notes together, to get my thoughts together, and to actually record the episode. So I couldn't fit everything that I wanted to in, but I just did the best that I could. And that's all anyone can do, And as I started watching the film, the thoughts came immediately, and I started thinking about things. And I thought about how through his deception, Sabzian is really casting himself in his own film. He constructs an unreal reality in order to play out his own dream of being a director. He's entering another identity, and he really sheds himself in the process. And I was thinking as I watched this film how much I relate to not wanting to be myself. I related so much to Sabzian, and I'm just going to say it I have so much affection for this man and love him so much. He's not with us anymore, and I'm going to talk about that after I talk about the film. I'm going to talk about Sabzian's life after the film and different things like that. So that'll come later on, but he did die in 2006, which is just makes me so sad. I'm not sure I've ever felt so connected to someone in a film. I mean, I can't remember, really. I can't think of a character, either in fiction or documentary, where I felt such an affinity and such a kinship with them. Well, maybe Wanda, Barbara Loden's Wanda for sure. Or Nicole Kidman and Jonathan Glazer's Birth. I mean, I do have certain films where I relate to them on a certain personal level, but Sabzian just captured my heart, all of his facets, Sabzian as himself, Sabzian as Makhmalbaf, Sabzian, in all his different formations. He certainly contains multitudes, I think. Everything about him fascinates me and obsesses me, and I just feel a kinship for him, and I do feel a tenderness for him. And so I'm going to be pretty biased with my review. I'm not going to be harsh on Sabzian, I'll just tell you that. But some people have been harsh on him and judgmental of him and stuff like that. But I so relate to his desire to not want to be himself, to want to be someone else. I understand that and why he would want to be someone important. He doesn't just pretend to be some random person. He purposely, pretends to be Makhmalbaf because of what that means to be a famous, well-respected director and the kind of prestige that brings to you. And he's cast in Kiarostami's film, and he's really able to, in a way, play out his dream for real through the film. Because here is someone who, since a child, has been obsessed with films and in love with films, and then here he gets to be in a film. But of course, that doesn't mean that his life was easy after the film or anything like that, which I'll talk about. And the film on its surface seems really simple. I think some people would watch it and think, oh, this is okay. But it is actually, so much is happening. People are playing themselves, they're reenacting scenes. We're never sure quite what's real and what's not. So there's always that aspect to the film, I think, where it's not simple at all. I don't think you could say this film is simple. And the film begins with the journalist who will end up writing the story for the magazine that Kiarostami reads and then is inspired to make the film. It was printed in a magazine like 1989, this story about Sabzian. And so the film begins with the journalist who actually wrote that story, and he is playing himself, and he's reenacting the scene where he goes to this family's house, this family that met Sabzian, who's pretending to be Makhmalbaf. And so he's reenacting that, and he's in the car, and I think already we're asked to really think about how reality is constructed. And I think the journalist can represent that in a way, or make you think of that. He is the one that will tell the story. He is the one that will frame it and that will construct the reality of this situation, the truth of this situation. And readers will read his piece and they will believe certain things about the story, just like we read stories today in the newspaper or online or on Facebook or Twitter. We are given a certain narrative that is shaped by someone else, and that shapes the reality of it. And we sometimes don't have the full story, and we sometimes don't have other perspectives. And so we think we're getting the truth, but we're really not. And I wonder if that could also be applied to film. Especially with a documentary film, we have this idea that when we see a documentary, we're seeing truth, we're seeing reality. But I think Kiarostami is asking us to think more deeply about that a film, whether it's documentary or fiction, and his is both, is a constructed thing. It is shaped by someone else who makes certain decisions to create a certain effect, or to do something to the viewer, that manipulation I was talking about. So, but I think focusing on the journalist and starting with the journalist, we're already getting into those murky, messy, complicated ideas about truth and reality and the way things are constructed. And I thought it was really interesting as I was watching the film, thinking about Sabzian and how devoted he is to cinema, how he really, loses himself in films. And as I watch this film, as I watch close up, I myself am disappearing from my life and escaping into this film. The act of watching the film, is enacting some of these ideas, you know what I mean? That film is an escape or film is a comfort. And I find that in my own life, dealing with depression, dealing with grief, dealing with health issues, dealing with loneliness, dealing with isolation, and all of the things that I deal with on a daily basis with my own life, that I escape into these films. I shed my own identity and lose myself in these films that I watch, and in a close-up in particular, I sort of shed my identity and lose myself in Sabzian, just as he lost himself in other people's films, the way he lost himself in Makhmalbaf's films, and so it reproduces that experience, And the screenplay itself is also by Kiarostami. I think that's worth noting as well, that he has a hand in all of this. He has scripted certain parts. He has made certain decisions. It is a creation of Kiarostami's. And that's an important thing to remember. At the beginning of the film, we are told that it's based on a true story, and we are told that the people are appearing as themselves. So at least Kiarostami is telling us up front. And I think that's important to be honest about that these are not actors. These are the actual people from the story. And I think that's the reason I watched it to begin with. I don't even know how I came to Close Up. It's like I remember why I watched certain films or who recommended a film to me. Sometimes I'll remember that. With Close Up, I have no idea. But I think I do remember being intrigued by the idea that the people had played themselves. And I don't think I had seen a film like that, where people played themselves, where they weren't being played by actors or whatever. And so I think I was really intrigued by that, and I wanted to see this film and what it was all about. So the journalist is going to this house, and he's with the police officers who are going to arrest Sabzian. And so some time passes. Like, the thing is that they go to the house where they're going to arrest Sabzian, but they don't show the arrest. We don't see it at that time. We see the taxi driver who drove the journalist there, and the police officers, I think. We see him outside doing things, and it's this beautiful moment. Like, I don't know, I love these moments in Kiarostami's films, like, where not a lot happens. It reminds me a little bit of my episode about Antonioni's La Ventura, where there are lots of scenes in that film where not a lot seems to happen, but they're just these beautiful moments, of time passing, and you get something similar with Close Up at the beginning, where the taxi driver gets out of the taxi and he picks up these flowers and he smells them. And then there's this can that rolls down the street. It's sort of atmosphere, it's life passing. It's things happening. Because even though Sabzian is sort of in his own tragedy and his own suffering, there is a world beyond Sabzian. There is a world beyond that particular story, and it exists at the same time. And other things are happening at the same time that Sabzian is being arrested. A man is picking up flowers, a can is rolling down the street. Life is continuing. Life is going on, And I love little moments like that in films. It doesn't bother me. I don't need every moment to advance some kind of plot. I'm totally fine with plotlessness in films. So he's arrested, and then we don't see the arrest really. But there are some interviews with different people. The arresting officer is interviewed, and he talks about how Sabzian doesn't look like he would do something like this, like he would lie and all of that. People interpret his actions as him trying to profit or take advantage of this family. There is a harsh judgment against Sabzian. The family feels very deceived. Although the family tries to make out that, like, the whole time they knew he was faking it, I think the family is like, they don't want to come off as like they were duped, because nobody wants to come off that way. They don't want to come off as like these gullible people that fell for Sabzian's charade, and his lie. But I think they did, and I think they got a little bit intoxicated with the idea that they might be cast in a film, that they might use their home as a location in the film. I think it spoke to their vanity, and I think maybe they're ashamed of that, or a little embarrassed at how caught up they got in it, I think at one point Sabzian even says that, or Kiarostami says that they were willing to like cut down their trees for a scene. Like, they would have done anything to have this movie made. It appealed to their vanity. It appealed to their sense of being important, and it made them feel important. And so it's very interesting to me how both the family and Sabzian are implicated in this shared charade. He feels important by pretending to be Makhmalbaf, and then they feel important because they think a director wants to put them in a film. And so both of them are mutually getting something out of this charade and out of this lie. But of course the family doesn't want to admit that, and they don't want to look like fools or like gullible people. So the family is interviewed and they talk about things. Sabzian, meanwhile, is in prison. He has been imprisoned for what he did, and he's charged with fraud. And there's this beautiful scene where Kiarostami goes to the prison to interview Sabzian. Now, I have no idea if this is reconstructed, or if he really went to the prison to interview Sabzian. Throughout the film, you don't know with these moments. Are they scripted? Are they reconstructed? It seems to me like everything really was reconstructed in some way. I guess the trial parts were real in some places, and then we know that the verdict was kind of, created. So Kiarostami goes to the prison, and we meet Sabzian really for the first time and start to get a sense of who he is. He's soft-spoken, he's shy, and he is aware of Kiarostami's work, and he's a fan of Kiarostami's. And Kiarostami asks him if there's anything he can do for Sabzian. And Sabzian replies, quote, "You could make a film about my suffering," unquote. And that killed me when he said that. I was like, oh my God. I think that's when I fell in love with him. Because, yes, he lied. Yes, he pretended to be Makhmalbaf. But he has his reasons for it, and the film is about, I think, showing those reasons and trying to give people who would be really harsh against Sabzian or would judge him a lot to try to see his side of it and try to see why he did it. And maybe in the process, Kiarostami is trying to understand it too. And, Sabzian does admit to the fraud. He doesn't pretend like he didn't do it, but he does not want to be seen as a con man. And apparently the article that the journalist wrote sort of represented Sabzian as like this con man, And the family thought, or they claimed that they thought, that Sabzian was going to steal from them, that he was checking out their house and stuff because he wanted to burglarize it. At one time, he does ask for some money. He claims that he needs a ride home, but he's actually just kind of poor, and he does ask for money from them, but I don't think it's a lot of money. And so there are people that judge him for that. But he does not see himself as a bad person or as a con man or anything like that. And of course the film is about showing why he did this. And he understands how it seems to other people. But then he says, quote, "I'm interested in art and film," unquote. And it's like the sweetest thing when he said, like, "I'm interested in art and film." He just seems like this really sensitive soul. He seems like this misfit. He seems like there's no place for him. And that's the kind of person that I really relate to, because I see myself in that way. I see myself as this person who doesn't fit in the world, who was not made for this world, who struggles to navigate it, struggles to survive it. I think it's really hard when you are sensitive or tender or soft, and you're interested in art, and you're sort of this dreamy, romantic person. It can just be hard. It can be hard to live in this world. And I see Sabzian as like the poster child for this. He is like the patron saint of dreamers and cinephiles. If cinephiles had a patron saint, it would be Sabzian. I'm calling him Saint Sabzian. That will be his name now. When Kiarostami meets Sabzian, he's been in prison several weeks, and the trial hasn't happened yet. So the trial is sort of on the horizon. Sabzian then tells Kiarostami to send a message to Makhmalbaf that one of Makhmalbaf's films called The Cyclist, he says it's part of me. So, oh God, when he said that about that film, I was like, oh my God. He gets it. I think he's someone who feels films. Like, you can tell he just feels them in the depths of his soul. And of course, that's where the obsession springs from. Because when you connect so deeply to something, how do you not become obsessed with it? I myself, in thinking about this subject of obsession, I have it myself, where like every moment that I'm not engaged in other things, I'm thinking about films. That's why it's called Her Head in Films. Because and with the podcast, I think the podcast is my enabler. I think all of you listening right now are my enablers for my obsession. Because doing these episodes, it's like, I don't know, it's made me even more obsessed with film. And I think my identity has become more intertwined with film and cinema, because I've started to construct this identity online as a film buff, as a cinephile, and I'm starting to project this image of myself like, I know about films, and I would never want to say I'm an authority about them, but I do watch a lot of them. And I think people have come to expect that from me. And so it just sort of reinforces it, where you've created this image. You're starting to think about yourself in a certain way, and then it just reinforces it. And it's like this cycle, like, oh, well, I have to keep watching films, and I do get obsessive, and I've talked about it on the podcast, where I go through almost like a mania, where I just want to watch films constantly and I can't stop. So Kiarostami gets permission from the officials to film the trial. And this is where we get our title, because he uses two different lenses as he's filming the trial. One of them is a wide lens so that he can show the whole courtroom and, all the people in it and, different things like that. And then the other lens is a close-up. It's going to do close-ups of the camera. It is going to do a close-up of Sabzian. And this close-up is going to show Sabzian's face and what he's thinking and what he's feeling. And it's going to centralize him, really, in these proceedings. So, that's where we get the title. And I think I actually missed that the first time I watched it. I didn't remember that at all. But I actually love that idea of doing the close up on Sabzian and getting his perspective and his feelings and all of that. And Kiarostami says something really important. He says that though Sabzian has pleaded guilty, things are much more complex with this story. They're much more complex than what the journalist wrote. And the camera, and I think this is what he says to Sabzian, he says the camera is there to show that complexity, to show what some people, quote, might find hard to understand or accept, unquote. So the camera really is there to show Sabzian's side of the story. I think Kiarostami knows that people in Iranian society, people in that particular society, will look at Sabzian and judge him and see him as a con artist, see him as a criminal, see him as someone reprehensible. You know, why would you lie? Why would you betray this family? And I think Kiarostami wants to show that there's much more to it than we realize, just like there is in life in general. You know, every story we hear in the news, there is more to it. And I've thought about this a lot lately with the media, you know, with the times that we're living in now, with this idea of fake news or alternative facts. I think it's really, really important to think about the way we are given stories, to think about the way truth and reality are constructed. And I think I would argue that that makes this film even more relevant and resonant right now. That the film is always relevant and it's always important, but the way it challenges the viewer to think about the construction of reality and truth, the way, you know, a film is put together and the way it is constructed, the way a journalistic story is constructed, how narratives are created that may not tell us everything, how important information and facts may be left out, that there may be a side that we're not hearing. I think that's important because Kiarostami is trying to show Sabzian's side, because that's the side that didn't get told in the journalist's story, and that's what the camera can try to show. I mean, can film be an oppressive thing at times? Yeah. Look through the history of cinema. There's racism, there's sexism, there's exclusion, there's all kinds of bad stuff that cinema has been part of, absolutely. But I think in the right hands, in the hands of somebody like a Kiarostami, right? Film can actually be a powerful tool to show us a more comprehensive picture of something, to show us a different side, to show us another narrative, and to show us how to think about truth and reality in cinema. I think that matters. I think that really does matter. So now we see some of the trial, but then we have our first reenactment, really. I mean, we know it's a reenactment. This is when we know that they're acting to some extent, because we see Sabzian on a bus. He's reading the screenplay of a Makhmalbaf film, and the woman from the family that gets deceived by him sits beside him. And so they meet for the first time. She asks him about the book, and he says that he wrote it. So this is when he starts to pretend to be Makhmalbaf on this bus with this woman. And she's very impressed, you know, that, oh, Makhmalbaf is sitting beside her. And he offers to autograph the book and to give it to her. And so this is where the charade begins. This is where the deception begins. and they are reenacting the scene. That's what's so strange about this film too, is that here are two people who are willingly reenacting a scene from their own lives that actually happened. Like, the layers here are insane. I mean, think about a moment in your life where something happened, and then imagine somebody coming to you and saying, I want you to reenact that moment for me on camera. I mean, it's a very strange proposition, you know. So they're acting, but they're also being themselves. They're trying to recreate a moment of truth through acting, through artifice, you know. And I'm not sure how to like explain that or why that's so interesting, but it is. I'm not sure. I think somebody deeper and more scholarly would know what to say about that, but it's just fascinating to think about these people reenacting moments from their own lives, you know? Even though there's no way that you can ever fully recreate it the way that it happened exactly, right? They're lying in a way. They're trying to convey the truth of that meeting, but they can't, because you can't really recreate it. I just love how he autographed the book. I was like, oh my God, this is so adorable. Like, he is so in this. Like, he is in this fantasy, right? It's adorable, but it's also kind of strange, right? That you would go that far with it and, oh yes, I'll autograph this book. But it's sort of this endearing moment, I think. He's just pretending to be someone. I don't think he thinks it's going to lead anywhere. I don't think he knows where it's going, obviously. He doesn't know that one lie will turn into many lies, and that it will turn into everything that it turned into. You know, not just the deception of the family and the trial, but the film of Close Up itself. Close Up would not exist without this story. It would not exist without Sabzian's deception and his lies. It just wouldn't. Then we're back at the trial. So not only is the film sort of looking at different levels of reality and truth, it's also playing with time. You know, 1 minute we're at the trial, 1 minute we're back in time, then we're back in the trial. We go back in time. The family says that it thought they were going to be burglarized, that perhaps Sabzian was part of some kind of group and he was going to come and burglarize their home because he was walking around it, he was looking at it, he was inspecting it. But obviously he was doing that because he said he wanted to make a film with them and he wanted to use their home as a location. You know, I think it's pretty obvious he did not intend to rob them, that he was playing this role. You know, he was pretending to be a director. And that's what he says. He says he's loved film since he's a child. When he was a child, he used to pretend to be a director, but he didn't have the money to pursue it. And I think this film is a critique, or at least an examination or an illumination of class in Iranian society. And I think it resonates beyond Iranian society, because there are so many dreamers in this world. There are so many people that have artistic, you know, desires and things that they want to do. They want to be a director. They want to be a writer. They want to be an actor. You know, they want to do something in the arts, but they're not able to because they don't have the means and they don't have the money. Nowadays, in a lot of the artistic professions, there's unpaid internships. So if you want to go into the film business, if you want to go into publishing, you're expected to do these unpaid internships. Well, how many people can afford to work for free? I mean, really. It would be people with connections. It would be people who have parents who are helping them pay rent. So in a lot of these professions, whether it's journalism, publishing, film, anything to do with the arts. These institutions more and more are populated by people with money, people who are in the higher classes and have money. It's very rare that somebody working class, will be part of these worlds, because it's just so difficult to break into them if you don't have money, or you don't have connections, or you don't have the ability to work for free. And that is also why a lot of those professions are having issues with diversity, whether it be racial or gender or even class diversity. We never talk about that. We talk a lot about racial and gender inclusivity and diversity, and that's crucial and important, and I'm not criticizing that. But I think we also forget class diversity, of people who are from the working class, who are from the working poor or poverty. They don't get to be part of those worlds either. They don't get to break into that. More and more, there is no social mobility here in the United States. It's like, if you're born poor, you're going to die poor. And it seems like that's kind of what happened with Sabzian. But I'm from a working class background. It's not an option for me to go into the arts. It's not going to happen, But that's why I'm grateful for this podcast. It's like, it just allows me to have an outlet for these thoughts and feelings I have about this art form of cinema, because I'm certainly not going to break into the film world or the film industry, not in the rural South. That's not going to happen. So this is my little taste of something special, I think. So it's very important to see that Sabzian is someone who longs and aches, longs for and aches to be someone that he cannot be. He cannot be a director. In order to make films, you have to have money. Somebody's got to finance your film. You need usually thousands of dollars to make a film, and sometimes millions. But usually, if you're independent, you could probably do it for, under $1 million. It takes a tremendous amount of money to make a movie. That wasn't possible for Sabzian, It just wasn't going to happen. So this is a man who has to live with his own personal failure and the shame that he probably feels because of it. That he can't be the person that he wants to be, that he dreams of being. And again, I can relate to that. Like, I'm this person, I'm a dreamer. I have so many dreams about what I want to do and all of that. And it can't happen. I have limited resources. I'm lucky, that I can do this podcast. I put money into it, and sometimes I feel insane, that I'm putting so much time and effort and work and my own money into this thing, into this podcast. And I just wonder, am I crazy? What I'm doing? But I'm passionate about it, and it is an obsession to a certain extent. And I want to follow this dream I have that's connected to cinema. And really, my podcast is my only way to do it. And so I just try to not think about those doubts. And so I think when you're a dreamer, it's really hard. When you just dream of being so many things, or there's just so much that you want to be and that you want to do in life, and you want to have a certain status, and you want to feel important, and you want to have a comfortable life, and you want to make a living at your passion and what you dream about. And for so many people, that's not possible. And it's not possible for Sabzian. And I think you feel his suffering over that and his pain over that. And so him pretending to be Makhmalbaf, it's just him trying to get a taste of that. And he only does it for like 4 days. This deception did not last for like weeks and months and years. He literally knew this family for like a week. I think it was less than a week. He was just playing a fantasy, He wasn't going to burglarize them. He wasn't going to hurt them. He just wanted to be respected. He just wanted people to think he was important, you know. He had always wanted to be a director, and so he gets to act like he's a director with this family. And he loves Makhmalbaf's films. There's a very specific reason why he pretended to be him, although he also looks a lot like him. When you see them together at the end of the film, you can kind of understand how somebody would think he was Makhmalbaf. They both have a beard. They look very similar. But what he loves about Makhmalbaf is that he saw his own suffering reflected in Makhmalbaf's films. And that was very, very important to him. I don't know necessarily if I've seen my own suffering reflected in a film. I would say the closest was Barbara Loden's Wanda, and that's probably why I have such a deep connection to it. I would say Nicole Kidman in Jonathan Glazer's Birth is another one where it's a film about grief. And even though I saw the film before my father died, he died in 2006 when I was 16 years old, and was a very devastating loss for me that I've talked about a lot on the podcast. It's like I can't explain myself without mentioning it. It's the key to me, I think. It's the key to so much of who I am and who I've become. But I saw that film when it first came out. I think it came out in 2004. I could be wrong. It came out in the early 2000s. So, and I don't think I've watched it since he died. I don't know when the last time was that I watched Birth. I mean, I could have watched it since he died. I don't know. I can't always remember these things. But it's a film about grief, and it is a film that speaks to my own grief. And I would say that and Wanda are really important films to me that I think sort of captured my own suffering, So there comes a point when Kiarostami, he gets very adamant with Sabzian, and he wants to know, really, why he impersonated Makhmalbaf, because he's not understanding it. And I don't think he totally understands why Sabzian asked for money, because, like I said before, he does ask for some money at one point, but he is poor. He can't even provide for his wife and children. He has very little money. And so I guess maybe he just had like a moment of weakness when he asked for money. I don't think it's the end of the world, if somebody without much money asks for some. But Kiarostami, he really wants to know why. He's not understanding it. He doesn't get it. And Sabzian says that that they gave him respect. I think this is the key to understanding why Sabzian pretended to be Makhmalbaf. It's not just his love of cinema. That's a big part of it, but it's not the whole thing. It is the respect that the family showed to him once they thought he was Makhmalbaf. He knew that this family would probably do anything he wanted them to do. I think it did give him a sense of power. And think about it, Sabzian is poor. He is nobody, really. And he feels his marginalization. I think he feels silenced. I think he feels small. I think he feels it profoundly. And Makhmalbaf is the opposite. Makhmalbaf is a legend. He is someone important. And so I think Sabzian just wants to step into his skin for a little while. He wants to imagine and enact what it might be like to be Makhmalbaf. But as he says in the, to Kiarostami, when he left the family's house, he was himself again. He was Sabzian. He was the same man with no money and no prestige and, no importance in society. He wanted to keep playing that role because he loved films, but I think more than anything, he wanted to keep playing that role for the respect that he felt in that moment from the family. And I think that is a really big, important part of why he did what he did, is that he felt like somebody important in society, and he felt like he mattered, and that he had some kind of power. And I understand that. I think all of us can understand that. We want to feel like we matter. We want to feel like we're important. And most of us are not. Most of us are not important. I'm not, not in my everyday life. I don't feel any kind of, like I matter to anybody. I'm very lonely. I'm very isolated. I don't really have much in my life. I have this podcast. I have films. I have things like that, and that's kind of what keeps me going. So I absolutely understand what Sabzian is saying, that he just wants to feel like he matters. He wants respect. I think the role he played as Makhmalbaf was an escape from his dire and desperate reality. I think that's really what it was. And it's just heartbreaking to me to think about what it must have felt like for him to be Makhmalbaf. I think probably the joy and excitement of it, and then to imagine him leaving the house, and then he's back to being himself again, because he can never stop being himself. There is no escape from that. And it's very interesting how Kiarostami really is part of the trial. He interjects at times, he asks his own questions. It's really, in a way, his own interrogation of Sabzian and trying to understand the motivations and psychology of this man and his act of fraud and his act of, deception against this family. The film itself sort of becomes a kind of interrogation of Sabzian as a character, of why he did this. But as I say, it only lasted a few days. He only had a taste of it for a few days. I don't begrudge him that he did it. Like, I'm kind of shocked that it went to trial. I'm just kind of shocked. Like, I think if it happened here in the United States, I don't think that would ever go to trial. I don't think a jury would hear it or listen to it. But you know what? It's just occurring to me now how maybe ahead of its time this film was in looking at people who pretend to be other people. Because think about the internet now. That is a big thing where people pretend to be who they're not. I mean, isn't there a show called Catfish that's kind of like that, where people pretend to be who they're not? And unfortunately, I recently watched a show, it's on in the Investigation Discovery Channel. Those of you who know me, I watch true crime obsessively sometimes. It's this show called Web of Lies, and it's about people who suffer like violence or a crime through the internet. Sometimes it's people who have been murdered after they met somebody online. Sometimes they survive. But it's all connected to the internet. And a story recently was about, and this is a really well-known famous story here in the States, this young girl killed herself. She had been corresponding with a young boy online, and they had a falling out, and he had written things to her like, you'd be better off dead, and things like that. Well, it turns out it wasn't a boy that she was corresponding with. It was the mother of one of her friends. She had had a falling out with this friend, and the friend's mom pretended to be this boy, and the girl ended up killing herself. She was so distraught, and this woman pretending to be this boy had sent her messages that were encouraging her really to kill herself. And when the family of this girl found out, they lost it. They were so upset. They were so mad. They felt like this woman had really caused the death of their daughter. And they did try to take her to trial, and they may have tried to charge her with fraud, actually. But I think it got thrown out by the judge. He said something like it would set a bad precedent, to charge people for lying on the internet. What I'm trying to say is that nowadays this is actually a really relevant issue of people who pretend to be what they're not, people who take on other identities, especially online. The internet has made that easier than ever to do that, to pretend to be another person, to put a different picture that's not you, to do a different name, to pretend and create these elaborate lies. Web of Lies is actually a fascinating show because there have been other episodes about this where people have pretended to be other people and have created these elaborate stories about themselves online, and none of it was real. None of it was true. And so I think Close Up in some way, maybe it predicted the world to come, right? Where people, or maybe it didn't predict it, but it is, I think, commenting on this, what do I want to call it? On this tendency of some people, or this capability, this capacity on the part of some people to pretend to be someone that they're not. And why do they do that? Do they do it because they want attention? Do they do it because they want to feel important? Sometimes they do it for more nefarious or violent reasons. Sometimes they don't. Some people do it because they want to feel important or they want attention. And so I think Sabzian was sort of doing that, But it's sort of interesting to think about it in the context of the internet and how people slip in and out of identities all the time online. So at the beginning of the film, we had seen the journalist go into the family's house, and we didn't get to see the arrest of Sabzian. But Kiarostami revisits that scene, and instead of us being outside of the house, now we're inside the house. And so once again, we're back in time. 1 minute we're at the trial where Kiarostami is questioning Sabzian, and then we're with Sabzian back in the family's house right before he's arrested. And he had spent the night there, and there's this really poignant moment where he's in his socks, and there's a hole in his sock, and his big foot, his big toe is hanging out of the sock. And it's just this reminder, I think, that of where Sabzian comes from. And he's in this really nice house, it's beautifully decorated, and then here he is with this huge hole in his sock, and it's a poignant reminder of his own reality, And we get to see him really pretending to be Makhmalbaf, and he lays it on thick. He's sitting in the living room. He really philosophizes about life and nature. He talks about how he tries to make the most of every day. He is very believable as Makhmalbaf. So then we see the journalist enter, and we realize that we're seeing this scene, from the inside instead of the outside. And Sabzian can see the police approaching. He doesn't try to resist it or anything like that. But he does get arrested. He doesn't have a record. He's never been in prison before. That's important to note. This is not a man who is habitually trying to hurt people or deceive people. He's just someone who finds comfort in cinema, and it helps him. He goes to cinema, I think, for comfort, to see his suffering represented. And he really says that he finds more comfort in cinema than the Quran, that he doesn't find a lot of comfort in religion. He finds much more in cinema. And I can relate to that as well because I'm not religious. And cinema is a kind of church or a kind of spiritual experience for me. And it's not like that for everyone. A lot of people go to movies. They're not looking for a spiritual experience. But for me, cinema is just on another level. When you see La Jetée, when you see La Ventura, when you see The Passion of Joan of Arc, those films take you to another place. Like, there's no way you could put that on the same level as... I don't even want to speak the name of the trash that gets created nowadays. Oh, God. You cannot put that on the same level as just your everyday film that comes out. These are films that are on the level of, like, Leonardo da Vinci or something. Like, to me, this is art. This is art. It transports you. It moves you. It is beautifully created. So I think there are those of us who see cinema in this way, and then there are those who don't, and if you're just the regular person who goes to the movies once in a while, you just don't get it. I think there are people that look at Sabzian and think, what in the world? They don't get it. I look at Sabzian and I'm like, oh my God, my kindred spirit. I understand him, But he really, I think, finds almost a religious experience or religious devotion and passion for cinema. At the trial, even though I guess we know now that some of it was possibly scripted, or that we know the verdict was sort of contrived, and some of this was contrived. Sabzian at the trial does say that he's not acting, that he's speaking from the heart. But of course, you never know when they are acting and when they're not. Like I said, we're never comfortable with this film. We never know exactly what we're seeing on the screen. So at the end of the film, the family withdraws the complaint. Well, now we know that Kiarostami kind of had a hand in that. And this is when we come to the ending of the film, where Makhmalbaf shows up and meets Sabzian. And Sabzian is so overcome, he begins to cry. He hugs him. We notice that they actually do look alike. That's what sort of struck me when I saw this scene again. I was like, oh my God. I can see how he got away with it, And they go on that ride on the motorbike. They stop for a few moments, and Sabzian picks out some flowers. I think he's going to take the flowers to the family. And it's just, oh my God. It's such a beautiful, beautiful scene of him on that motorbike holding those flowers. I can't get over it. Like, it's still just, I'd seen the film before. I knew what was going to happen. I knew what the ending was going to be. And yet I saw it and it still moved me. I was so overcome because in those 4 years since 2014, I have grown as a cinephile. I mean, I've watched so many more films. Film has become even more central and important in my life. And so that scene for me was to hear Sabzian, crying and getting emotional, if it was real, I don't know now because of what Cheshire told us, that this was actually possibly maybe staged. I guess it was staged, but it felt so real. That's always my conflict with a film, is that I know it's not real. I know the characters are not real. I know the story's not real. I know what I am seeing did not happen in reality. But the film is its own reality, and it becomes your reality as the viewer. It becomes part of you. Just like when Makhmalbaf said that just like when Sabzian said that one of Makhmalbaf's films was part of him. That's what happens with film for me, is that bits and pieces of it break off and they become part of me. They are embedded into me. They change me. I feel changed by them. I feel like my genes and my DNA are changed by these films. It feels so tangible. It feels so real to me, but it's not. And what this podcast is, and any time I talk or write about films, is me trying to convey that experience of this transformation, this alteration that happens inside of me trying to communicate that, of me trying to put into words something that only exists in this immaterial part of me, in my cells, in my blood, in my imagination. How do I put that into words? And that's what I'm trying to do, through the podcast, through my writings about film, any time I engage with film. It's what I'm trying to do, and it's so difficult. And that final scene, of Sabzian meeting his idol, it's so poetic. It's such a poetic ending of him meeting this man, Makhmalbaf. It made me think about, who would I like to meet and drive on a motorbike with? Who's the director that I would like to meet like that and tell them, what they meant to me, and who's the director that would probably make me cry? And I would have to say Krzysztof Kieślowski. He's a Polish director. He did the Three Colors trilogy. He did the Double Life of Veronique. I have done an episode about the Double Life of Veronique. I attempted to talk about that film because it means so much to me, and it's one of my top favorite films. And so, yeah, I would get on a motorbike with Kieślowski. He's dead. He's not with us anymore. And I would tell him what his films mean to me, and I would be bawling and sobbing. I wish Kieślowski was still with us. I really do. It pains me constantly that he's not with us anymore. I mean, what he did with Decalogue. I have an episode about Decalogue. How could I forget? It was the second episode of this podcast. Yeah, I've done the Decalogue. I've done the Double Life of Veronique. I don't know if I will ever try to touch the Three Colors trilogy. I mean, it just feels so beyond me. But he is the director that I would want to meet and just say, oh, your films, they just touch my heart and they mean so much to me. And so I'm glad Sabzian got to have that moment, and he got to say what the films mean to him, or he got to convey that in some way. It's a poetic ending, and it's really beautiful, even if it is contrived and staged. Yeah, this film, it just challenges you on every level. It has heart, it has emotion, it has feeling, but then it also has that postmodern aspect to it, that intellectual rigor, I think, where Kiarostami is playing with form. He's playing with our ideas about what's real and what's not, with what's documentary and what's fiction. He's operating on many different levels of reality, having people play themselves and reenact scenes from their own lives. He's asking big questions always. I think he was always asking big questions. and he did it beautifully and poetically and brilliantly, and he was definitely one of the greatest. And this film just, how could I not talk about it? I had to talk about it. It's a formative film. It's important to me. But I want to go beyond the film, and I want to talk a little bit about Sabzian and about his life after the film, and and just what it was like for him. So I definitely want to do that. For me, Close Up does not end when the film ends. For me, this film continues. It has a life that it takes on inside of me, inside of the viewer. I think it's one of those films that you don't forget. And I think you wonder about Sabzian. And you wonder what happened to him after the camera stopped rolling. You know, after he got a little bit of attention probably for being in this film. What happened to Sabzian? And so that's why I want to do this last segment about him. Because I don't know how you can't fall in love with him. Although I know that some people see him in a different way than I do. You know, they see him as troubled. They see him as a loner. They see him as someone who is too consumed by cinema. And maybe he was, you know, but to me, he is, I mean, I would never compare my situation to his. You know, I am not in Iran. You know, that is a very specific society, a specific experience of living in that country and being a poor person or being someone who's marginalized. You know, I live in the Western world. I live in the United States. I've struggled, you know, I've been working class. I've, you know, not had access to resources, gone without food at times, or been food insecure. I've almost been homeless. You know, there are things I've been through, but I know it's not the same as the kind of poverty and the kind of hardship that occurs in other countries. And I would never equate my experience with his. But in him, I do see a kindred spirit. I do see someone who I profoundly feel connected to and that I relate to. He is so in love with film. It's beautiful, you know, and it's relatable, but he's also someone who I think is broken. He's suffering, and he finds solace and comfort in movies, and he also doesn't belong in the world. So he is this outcast, he is this misfit. And so I find him to be such a compelling character. And he is complicated, you know, and maybe he is troubled. You know, maybe you could see him that way, but I see him as more of someone who is suffering, someone who is struggling, and who finds solace in films. So I do want to talk a bit about what happened to Sabzian after this film. There was a film made 5 years after Close Up. It was made in 1995. And it's called Close Up, Long Shot. It's by a director named Mahmoud Chakrahali. And he talks to Sabzian, but he also talks to Sabzian's friends and family. And so it's very interesting to get an idea of how other people see Sabzian. But then also how he sees himself, and he gets to express his opinions and his thoughts and what he thinks in the documentary. So it's actually a really important document, I think. And if you do watch Close Up on Filmstruck, I definitely recommend, after watching it, watching this Close Up long shot, because I think it will give you a fuller picture of Sabzian and what happened to him after the film. But as I said, he is this figure that he really represents the power of cinema, what cinema can mean to the poor, to the downtrodden, to the forgotten, you know, and how cinema can be both life-saving and life-sustaining, that art can be life-saving and life-sustaining. Because he says at one time in Close Up, I'm interested in art and film. I wonder if his interest went beyond film. I mean, I would imagine that this is a man who was very widely read, and he seemed to really devour art, So people talk about him having this obsession, but sometimes an obsession can be life-saving. An obsession can keep you going. It can help you survive difficult circumstances in your life. And so this 1995 documentary is really about Sabzian, the man, beyond the film, beyond close-up. It's about a man enraptured and in love with cinema and obsessed with it to the point where you could make the argument that he actually loses a lot because of cinema, because of his obsession. But at the same time, it's why he lives. It's what keeps him alive. And so I want to share some things from the documentary. The way people see Sabzian is really complicated, I think. They see him, they're not movie buffs. They're not people who are really into cinema. I don't think they quite understand him, really. They see him as a dreamer. They see him as someone who doesn't fit into society. I mean, he really is an outcast in a lot of ways. And it's just, it's hard for me to talk about Sabzian because I don't think I've ever felt so connected to a person. When he does these interviews in this documentary, Close Up Long Shot, I could relate to everything he said. And so I want to share some of his words because they're beautiful. I mean, this man was, I think, a poet in some way. He articulated the power of cinema in a way that I don't think I've ever come across. I don't think I've ever seen a portrait like this or a man like this, a person who has put into words what cinema means to him. I've just never encountered it before. And so I just think he's extraordinary. And so I want to share some quotes from this documentary because they are superb. And they really articulate some of my own feelings about cinema. So Sabzian says, quote, "Whenever I see a film, I dissolve myself in it to such an extent that I reach the bottom. I fade out, and perhaps I get lost in it. And this has played an essential role in my life. Cinema is important to me. It's like a prism. A good film is part of my life. With every good film I see, I feel reborn. It feels as if I made it myself, as if it were my creation. I identify with the director. I identify with the actors. I feel attuned and in harmony with the atmosphere of the film. I feel as if it's my story. That's how films carry me away. That's why they've become my obsession." Unquote. I love some of the phrases in this about films making him feel reborn, about how he internalizes the film and how it feels like he made it himself. I love how he says that he gets carried away by films. And that's just something that I totally relate to. When I think of some of the best memories of my life, when I think back on my life and think about things that made me happy or made me feel comfort or made me feel alive, I think of movies. I think of films I saw in movie theaters. These are very intense experiences. I remember I haven't been to a movie theater in years because of where I live. I live in a very rural area in the South. And there is no art house theater where I live. I do not get to see foreign films on a big screen. I'm sure I'm not unique, but I think those of you who live in larger cities may take it for granted. If you live in New York, if you live in LA, if you live wherever, and they have these films available to you, you may not realize that not everybody has access to that, and I certainly don't. The only movie theater within distance of where I live only plays blockbusters. They don't even play the Oscar films. I don't even get the Oscar films. I literally get the Dwayne Johnson movies, or I get animated movies. or superhero films. And that is not what I care for. It's fine if you like Dwayne Johnson. It's fine if you like his films. But I'm not going to go pay $10 to see those films. So I don't get to see these movies in a theater. Now, in the past, I was a little bit luckier, and I had a few times where I was able to see certain films in a theater. And I hold on to those memories and cherish them because they were really important experiences. And I remember also watching films in my film appreciation class from high school that I've talked about. I mean, I was in that class over a decade ago. I graduated high school in 2007. So I'm talking about memories that are over a decade old from high school. And they are so intense to me that I still think about them. I still think about being in a darkened theater and watching films, and like I would look up and I could see the box where the projector was and I could see the light coming out of it. And that to me was like so comforting. And I wouldn't say that at that time I considered myself a cinephile or a film buff the way I do now. Now I would call myself a cinephile. I don't think I'd call myself a film buff. When I think of a film buff, I think of someone with like an encyclopedic knowledge of film. I don't have that. I can't tell you factoids about different actors in different films. But I consider myself a cinephile, and it's so strange that at the time that I saw those films like a decade ago, I wouldn't have characterized myself as someone who was a cinephile or who really was obsessed with film. That didn't happen until 2011 in my early 20s. And yet when I look back and think about those memories, they are so intense. Or when I think about certain films I saw years ago, it's so intense, and it's part of me. Like Sabzian said about the films of Makhmalbaf, they are part of me. Or that particular film, The Cyclist, is part of me. You take these films into your body, into your soul, into your heart. The stories that are told. And that's how I feel about Close Up, that I have taken this story into me. That I have made it a part of me, that Sabzian himself will always be a part of me, that in him I see my own love of film reflected, and I see some of my own suffering reflected, that he is someone who is marginalized, someone who doesn't have a voice, someone who is really nobody in everyday life, in Iranian society. He has no status. He's not important. But he's full of dreams. He's burning. He's on fire with his dreams to be this celebrated director, to be a Kiarostami or a Makhmalbaf. And I have dreams too. I have so many dreams. And I had a lot of dreams when I was a kid. I've always been dreamy. I've always daydreamed and stuff. And I always wanted to be a million things, wanted to be a writer. I want to be this. I want to be that. But I think above all, I always just wanted to matter. And I wanted to feel important. Because I don't feel that way, I just feel like I'm not here most of the time. I just feel like I'm disappearing. And then I don't even leave a trace, That's how I feel. I feel so unreal and so disconnected from life. I feel that a lot. And I just feel like I'm nothing, And I struggle with that feeling all the time. And so when Sabzian talks about his own suffering and his own marginalization, I get it. Yes, we are on opposite sides of the world in a way. He's in a completely different country, a completely different culture. He's so different from me in so many ways. But I see parts of myself in him, and he is part of me, And I have sympathy for him. He might be troubled, but maybe I'm troubled. Maybe I'm strange and weird and, talking into this microphone and doing this podcast. Maybe I'm crazy and strange, Maybe that's okay. Maybe we need people like that. We need people like Sabzian, And I think that these two films in particular, Close Up and Close Up Long Shot, I think these films are Sabzian's legacy, whether he knew it or not. I don't know if he understood fully the way he reached people and what his words did for other people and how he did for other people what Makhmalbaf did for him. That he represented and reflected the suffering of other people and articulated that. I really think these two films in particular are his legacy, and they were an outlet for him to express his passion for film. And I think that's really an important part. And this interview with Sabzian in this film, Close Up Long Shot, he talks so beautifully. He talks about how he'd like to live alone in the mountains. And he says something very startling. He says, and I can't get this out of my mind ever since I heard it. He said, quote, "If I didn't have to go on living and were courageous enough, I'd have liked to be hanged from the beams of cinema," unquote. So he basically wants to be hanged from the beams of cinema. This is someone who, I don't know if cinephile is a strong enough word for this person, really. I think he's gone beyond all of us in his obsession and his adoration for this art form. His life is cinema. And he says that if he was a director, he would use cinema to fight injustice. And I don't think we often think about cinema in that way, of cinema as a tool to fight injustice. I think we often see it as entertainment, and pleasure. And it is, I think it is for me a lot, but I think that's an interesting idea, to use cinema to fight injustice, to use cinema to fight oppression. And I wonder what that would look like. And I think some people do use cinema in that way, or they're trying to use cinema in that way. And I think that's a worthy way to use cinema. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, I wish he could have been a filmmaker, really. I mean, imagine if Sabzian had been able to make films. I really wonder what they would have looked like. I wonder what kind of stories he would have told. But as beautiful as Sabzian is, I think, as a person, he's different. And we see that through the way other people see him in this little documentary. And we see Sabzian's life after the film, and it's not very good. He's still poor. He works at a book bindery, so he binds books. He actually works for a man that he used to work with years ago, and now this man owns the bookbinder. He owns this business and obviously has a good, comfortable life, and Sabzian is actually working under him and working for him. And at this time, Sabzian has lost his wife. She's left him because he doesn't have money. He does not have his children. He has 2 children who are not part of his life. He does not have a steady job. The man, his boss, says that Sabzian really isn't interested in work. He only is interested in films. And he calls Sabzian's obsession with film an insanity. That it is an insanity. Because it seems like everything Sabzian does is for film. That he has no life beyond films. That every moment, is devoted to them. And sometimes he works. He doesn't have a steady job or a steady income. Sabzian talks at length in the documentary about how he feels he was portrayed in Close Up. He seems ambivalent about the film. As much as I love it, as much as other people love it, he himself is very ambivalent about it. And he seems bitter. I'm going to use the word bitter. I think he feels like he's given everything he has to cinema, but I think he wonders what he has received in return. He was in the film, he did the film, but his material life has not changed at all. He's still poor, he's still struggling, he's still marginalized. And I think we need to ask an ethical question here about the film and about Kiarostami. This is not an attack on Kiarostami or anything like that. But I think we need to ask it because he asks big questions and difficult questions in his films. Did he use Sabzian? What obligation does a director have to the people who are in their films? You cast them in the film, they're non-professional, they're everyday people. Do you have any obligation to them after that film ends? What does it mean that Kiarostami made this film? This film put him on the map. It really catapulted him onto the international stage. He became a luminary. He became a very important figure in world cinema. He is an icon. He is a legend, and partly because of Close-Up. But Close-Up would not exist without Sabzian. Without Sabzian agreeing to tell his story, agreeing to be in the film, and agreeing, like the family he deceived, to being part of the film. Remember when he's telling the family, you don't you want to be in the film? And they like it. They want to be in the film. They are intoxicated by the idea of being in a film. Well, Sabzian did the same exact thing, didn't he? He wanted to be in Kiarostami's film. He agreed to be in it. He agreed to let his life be used in cinema. He allowed his story to be used. But Sabzian did not gain anything from it. Materially, it doesn't seem. I don't know. He's still poor, He doesn't have a film career. It's not like this film allowed him to get into the film industry. It didn't allow him to become a director. It didn't really lead to anything for Sabzian. And that is what he talks about in this film. He says, he really points out the hypocrisy of him being judged, of him being seen as this con artist and this liar, while there's no critical look at the family that he lied to. And this family wanted the prestige of a film. And the journalist who wrote the story, the journalist used that story for his own gain and his own career. He knew that writing that story would help his career. So he's using Sabzian as well. And Sabzian brings up Kiarostami and says, he even kind of compares him to a con artist. That he's saying that what he did, pretending to be Makhmalbaf, was no different than what these other people in the film were doing. That he was not the only person who was morally compromised. That the whole film is filled with morally compromised people. People who are desperate to be in a film and will do anything to be in it. A journalist who is taking advantage of a story to help his career. A director who is making a film about all of this and who uses that film for his own career and his own gain, because this film put Kiarostami on the map. It was an important film in his career. So Sabzian just says it. He says all that basically. I'm paraphrasing. But he does, I think, feel slighted. He feels like all these other people gained. The journalist gained something by writing the story. Kiarostami gained something by making the film. He didn't gain anything. He's working at a book bindery. He looks very thin in the film too. His hair is very gray. It's only been 5 years since since Close-Up, and in this documentary, he looks much older, and it's only been 5 years. His eyes look very sad and very empty in a way. So I have to bring it up. I have to bring up that conflict inside myself when I think about Kiarostami gave Sabzian a voice. I would never deny that the film gives him a voice, that the film immortalizes Sabzian, right? That a lot of people don't get to have a film made about their life, and they don't get to be represented, in a mainstream film that becomes really famous and popular. But at the same time, did that really change Sabzian's material circumstances? And I don't know the full story. Could he have gotten something from the film and then just sort of wasted it? Or, I don't know the full story. I can only tell you the way Sabzian represents it. That I think he feels bitter about it, and I think he feels slighted. That all these people profited, all these people, gained an advantage through this film and through his story, except him. That it didn't lead to anything in his life except more hardship and more heartache, He says at one time that he feels like he sold his soul to cinema, that he's put so much time and so much money into it, and I think he wonders perhaps if it has been worth it. And so I think you could almost call it's like more than an obsession, it's like an addiction. It's like he can't stop. And he traces his love of cinema back to his childhood, back to his father taking him to see movies. And it seems to be part of maybe why he's so obsessed with it, is that connection to his childhood. But everything that he's put into it, I think he wonders how much has he really gotten out of it, He doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have his children, he doesn't have a life, like a comfortable life or a steady job or anything like that. He traces his love of cinema back to his childhood and to his father taking him to films. And so I wonder if some of his obsession is connected to him being a child and maybe to a better time in his life, perhaps. Although he does share a disturbing memory of being whipped by people. I think they were trying to teach him like a lesson or something, and that he shouldn't. I can't remember. But he talks about difficult experiences from his childhood as well. So his cinema obsession has taken a lot from him. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have his children. He doesn't have a steady job. He doesn't have a comfortable life. He's still struggling. He was in the film, but it doesn't seem like it's really changed his life in any way. He may have agreed to do the film because he thought it would lead to that it would lead to him being able to get into the film industry and maybe act more or something like that. And I want to share with you an article that was written after he died. Sabzian did die. He died in 2006. And in the magazine Badoon, Coco Ferguson writes about Sabzian and his death. They write, quote, "He suffered respiratory failure on the Tehran metro in August, slipped into a coma, and passed away on September 29th. Sabzian was a complex figure, a troubled loner. He spent the last few years hawking DVDs in Tehran's South Bus Terminal. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of film. Close-Up was the closest he ever got to realizing his dream of becoming a celebrated film director," unquote. So I think in some ways Sabzian is a bit of a tragic figure, and his life, or what happened to him, makes me sad. It makes me sad to think about Sabzian, this man who is such a dreamer, so sensitive, so in love with cinema, and I think that if given a chance, he could have shared that love with more people. He could have had even more of an impact. I wish that he had been able to dedicate his life to cinema. I wish he could have had a career, where he made money and could provide for himself while also engaging in his love of film. Like, I wish that for him. And he didn't get to have that. I mean, he got his moment of glory in this one film, Close-Up, but he never got really anything else. And it just makes me so sad to think of him on the streets of Tehran selling DVDs to people, and although I imagine, did he strike up conversations with people? What kind of DVDs was he selling? Did he talk about the DVDs with people? I sort of wonder about that. I just think he was such an extraordinary person, and it just hurts me. It breaks my heart to think about the trajectory of his life, that here was this person so intelligent, so passionate, so sensitive. I mean, this beautiful, beautiful soul. And the world just killed him. Like, the world just destroyed him and broke his heart, you know? That's what this world does to dreamers. It's what it does to romantic, sensitive people. It just eats you alive. It just destroys you. There is no place for people like that in this world. And so I almost feel like Sabzian was too good for us. He was too good for this world. But I'm glad we have some of his words. And I'm glad we have something of him through these films, whether it's close up or whether it's close up long shot, where he is showing a more complicated portrait of himself. He's showing his anger, he's showing his disappointment, but he's also showing his love and passion and what cinema means to him. And yeah, I think when you have an obsession, you can wonder, I'm giving so much to this, I'm giving so much, what am I getting out of it? I think that can definitely be something that you wonder about. But he did love cinema, and he did love films, and so I hate the way his life ended. I really do. It upsets me to no end. And there's a very interesting scene in the little documentary Close Up Long Shot where he says something like, he's small, because he is a small man, but he's deep. He says that he has a lot of depths that people don't even know about, that you could never reach the bottom of how deep he is. I believe that. I think he was a deep and beautiful and extraordinary person. And he had his problems. He had his issues. We all do. But fundamentally, he was someone that just did not fit into his society. And honestly, I don't think he would have fit in any society. I don't think it's specifically Iranian society. I mean, maybe some people who are more knowledgeable about it would make that case. I would argue he wouldn't have fit in United States society either. American culture would not have been kind to him either. It's not kind to those of us who are soft and tender and sensitive and dreamy. He wasn't made for this world, That's how I feel about myself a lot. Like, I was not made for this world. I cannot survive it. I cannot navigate it. It's just too much. It's too painful, But I have found cinema, and literature and art, and those are the things that help me survive, and they are what sustain me. And I think they did the same for Sabzian, that he knew he didn't fit anywhere. He knew that he was different and that he was going to struggle. But he had cinema, and that was the companion. That he describes like taking the hand of cinema. That his father, he compares it to like his father took his hand, and then cinema took his hand, and his father's hand went away, but cinema's hand never did. That cinema was always there holding his hand, and it never left his side. And I think that's so beautiful. Again, I've never encountered someone that articulated cinema this way and went beyond the intellectual. It's not that he's not smart and that he's not an intellectual person, but this is what I talk about when I mean going beyond academia. I do not think that that is the main way we should talk about film. I understand there's film theory. I understand that that is an important thing, that academics do important work with what they do and with film theory and all of that. And I would never denigrate it, ever. But there is this other line, I think, with film that is personal, that is emotional, that is subjective, that is passionate, that is more about feelings than it is about a theory or some intellectual thing. And that, for me, is what Sabzian is articulating and expressing. He's articulating that personal experience with cinema, the way that cinema becomes incorporated into your life. That's certainly how I feel about it. That's what I try to do in this podcast, is I try to talk about cinema in personal terms, in a personal way, that really communicates the relationship that develops between you and a film, or you and cinema in general, and how it can be life-saving and life-sustaining. And that is why I love Sabzian so much. It's because he understood that. He understood that this was life or death. That he didn't really probably want to live if he couldn't have cinema, if he couldn't have films. That was the meaning of existence. That was the reason for living. I don't know if I'm quite as obsessed as he was. I have other interests beyond film. I like books, I like art, I like other things, and he may have too, but cinema seemed to be his primary obsession. So I have talked on and on and on about this film. It's extraordinary, it's beautiful, there's a lot of layers to it, and it raises a lot of questions, it plumbs a lot of depths, it explores a lot of issues, and I think each viewer brings something different to it. For me, I fell in love with Sabzian. I felt an immediate kinship and connection to him, and that for me is the meaning of the film. That is my personal connection and relationship to it, is this person of Sabzian and how much he means to me and how extraordinary he was. And so we lost him, and it's sad. It's sad to think that he's not in the world anymore, because he was such a great ambassador for cinema. And I think the world is a little less beautiful because he's not in it. And I know that's so cliche and stupid to say, but it hurt when I read that he died. Because I didn't know. I watched the film, and then I went and researched and put in his name. And then that came up that he had died. And I just thought, God, another light has gone out, in the world, because I think he was a beacon. And I think he will continue to mean so much to people, as long as we have cinema, as long as we have films. So I'll stop here. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, keep watching great films. Bye for now.